Okay, so now I've made 3 strips of sashing, and I'm going to start with the length of my quilt first. I've pinned down the first strip of sashing. I'm going to go to the second and pin this down. So the first thing I do is I just kind of line it up, make sure that my seam allowances are covered and my stitching lines are covered, and then I secure them down with a pin. And before I get too carried away, I want to check with a ruler and make sure that these are nice and parallel. So we'll make one more pin here, and then we'll do some checking. Now I have this one set, so I'm going to take my square ruler and I'm just going to check for parallel. Sometimes I'll take a little glue stick and just secure them down a little bit with the glue stick, just to kind of keep them from shifting too much. Just kind of secure my edges down a little bit. If you use a fabric glue stick, it will usually dissipate or wash away afterwards, and it's not going to give you any extra stiffness or anything. So I'll just anchor it with a glue stick. There are other products that you can use, but this is the one that I like. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of my sashing lined up, get them all nice and parallel, and then we'll stitch them down. I am ready to sew. I have pinned my sashing down. I've checked all 3 of my sashings for perfect parallel, and now it's time to break out the sewing machine and start stitching these sashings down. The stitches will go all the way through to the back, then that will be securing the back to the front of the quilt at the same time. I will start in the center strip, I'll secure it down, and then I'll take it out, I'll check for parallel again, adjust as needed, and then go with my outside strips. It's not as painstaking as it sounds. If you have a good quality sewing machine, it's going to do most of the work for you. I will use a stitch length of 3.0, and I like to use my built-in IDT dual feed. I'm using a FOF sewing machine. If you do not have a FOF with the built-in IDT, please put on your walking foot at this point. That'll help keep your strips from shifting. So I'm going to go ahead and secure these down, and then I will lay my cross strips using the same process. Lay them down, check for parallel, pin, add a little bit of glue stick here and there just to kind of keep them from shifting, and that will complete my quilt top center. Alrighty, we're going to get started. So now as I'm securing my strips down, I want to go over a couple of things with you. First of all, you should never sew over pins. I know that we all do it from time to time, and if you must do it, please do it very carefully and very slowly. But for the most part, it is avoidable and should be avoided. If you do happen to hit a pin, you need to stop right away, take that needle out, throw it away, because the needle is going to be damaged, whether it looks damaged or not. The point on the needle will be flat, and your machine's going to start popping. It's going to make a popping noise when it goes through the fabric. So if you do happen to run over a pin, just stop, change your needle. Don't even wait till you get to the end of your row. A couple of other things that I do before I get started: I always test out my fabric on a little test sample just to make sure my tensions are perfect. And a couple of tools that I like: I want a good pair of sharp scissors. Since it's October, I'm on the Oktoberfest theme. I'm using a German FOF sewing machine, and I'm using German Kretzer scissors. You know, just stay in the celebration. This is another tool that I love. It's really expensive. It costs $3.50. It's called that purple thing, and it's got a flat end on one end, a point and a curve on the other. It's got a little eyelet, so if you wanted to thread ribbons or something through, it's a huge asset to my sewing room. If you're getting really close, you can use it to kind of help secure your sewing down. If you're getting in somewhere real close under your presser foot and your needle, it saves your fingers. So these are some of the tools that I love to use when I'm doing this technique. And I'm just going to continue sewing through, pull out my pin. Also, don't stick the pins in your mouth once you take them out. I know we all do it, but don't do it. You don't want to make a trip to the emergency room after you've swallowed a pin. Believe it or not, this sewing machine is over 25 years old, and I've got the privilege of being married to Uncle Creepy, who you've probably seen in these videos. And his name is really Glenn. Glenn is a master at rebuilding these German Pfaff sewing machines. So this is a 1473 that he has just rebuilt, and it is really sewing beautifully. These machines have a sound and a feel to them like no new machine today. So I'm using the Pfaff 1473, and as I told you before, you should use a walking foot when you're doing this technique, and this machine, of course, has a built-in walking foot, which is this little gizmo back here. This actually comes underneath the foot, and it feeds your top layer equally with your bottom layer. It's like having four-wheel drive on a sewing machine. So I have the first side of my center sashing done. I'm going to go ahead and stitch down the second side, check everything for parallel, and stitch the rest of them down. Now I've finished attaching my sashing to the length of the quilt. Now I'm going to start attaching the sashing to the cross grain of the quilt. And another way that you can work on your alignment and making sure things are parallel is to put your sashing on one seam at a time. So going in this direction, just to show you, I'm going to start in the center. I've pinned down my sashing, and I'm just checking my measurements with the next seam over to make sure that I'm straight, parallel, and that my measurements are all exact, which they are. I've pinned this down and I've used my glue stick in my intersections just to give myself a little bit more support. And now I'm going to stitch my first sashing down, and then I'll go to my next and measure it against this seam, and so on and so forth. So in a few minutes I'll have this completed. The wonders of time-lapse photography. I'm just finishing up my last piece of sashing, and this quilt top will be completed. All done. So there's my quilt top, and as you see with this method, well, you can see but you can't feel it, but I can. The quilt feels very soft, very pliable, even with all of this quilting and embroidery and with the sashing. That's because of this method, because I'm butting my seams instead of sewing them together. And then I've quilted through to the back. I don't know if you can see that, but I have double stitching all the way through the quilt. That'll be sufficient for holding the back to the front. My next step will be to trim and true all of my edges, and then I will add my borders, and I will add my borders in another video. Before I end this, I want to touch on a few things. First of all, a lot of you will ask me, how do you do this with a large quilt, like a bed quilt? I have done this with, I have used this method with bed quilts, both twin size and full size. I haven't gone to Queen and King yet, but it's certainly possible. And the trick is you do it in sections. So you're going to do a section no larger than this, front and back, and then you will join it. I will cover how to do that in my next video, because you're going to use the same method for joining your sections as you would for joining your borders when we do the borders. So it's very possible to make a quilt as large as you want using this method. This method can be used for a number of different types of quilts and projects. This is a mini quilt, and this is a Anita Good Design mini quilt CD, and each one of these blocks is very small, probably 2 inches by 2 inches. The center block is 4 by 4, and you can just imagine if you have a pre-quilted block with all this quilting and stitching and batting and backing, joining that with a seam allowance is going to be very bulky. So again, I just butted them together, and then I used a 1/2 inch sashing instead of a 3/4. I used a 1/2 inch sashing, and as you see on the back, I added my backing and stitched through, and then added my border, brought my border to the front. Borders are a lot of fun. All of these techniques are in my 2 books, Build As You Go, Machine Quilting, which I've already mentioned. I'm in the process of doing a rewrite on this book to make the methods more simplified, faster, quicker, easier, and more fun, although it is easy as it is. My second book is Build As You Go, Machine Quilting 2, all the way through. And in this book, I'm going to show you how to add your borders, how to do more advanced techniques with the Build As You Go method. This method will take you as far as you want to take it. I'm going to now recap the method in general, and then we'll end this video and continue till the next time. In general, when I do the Build As You Go quilting method, I foundation piece on a piece of batting. So I know in this video I did embroidery, I made my blocks with the embroidery machine. But if you're just a traditional quilter and you want to use this method, you can follow this rule of thumb. I take all of my blocks, my strips, and I piece directly onto my batting. So I would use a flip and sew method with this for this particular block, which would be the funky split rail. So I'm going to just put my right sides together, stitch and flip, and I just work my way down the block doing that. I always make my blocks several inches larger than my finished block. So once I have my block complete, I can embellish this, I can embellish my seams. I'm big on embellishing, I'm big on decorative stitches, but you don't have to be to do this technique. But if I get a hold of you, you'll be using your decorative stitches, trust me. But once you've made your blocks, you're going to take your square. In this case, I take a 6-inch square. It's actually 6.5. And I can either cut it this way, or I can skew it. I can do it any way I want. So you'll see that I basically am skewing the block. That's what's making it funky. That's the funky part of the funky split rail. So I've skewed the block, and I'm going to trim with my rotary cutter. I'm going to trim all 4 sides, and that will give me my funky block like this. Then I'm taking my heat press batting and fusing the back together, butting my seams and fusing the backs together, or fusing the blocks together on the back side. Okay? So that's the next step. Fuse my blocks together, butted seam, no overlap, no bulk. And once I have all my blocks fused and in place, I lay them down, I add my backing, and I stitch. I make my sashing. In this case, I'm using a 1/2 inch sashing. I use my sashing to cover up my raw edges, add my backing, stitch through, and I have quilted all the way through to the back. That's all there is to this technique, to this method. So give it a try. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, or call me. I'm always here for your assistance. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your audience, and we'll see you soon.